Can you relate? Is calendaring at your house high-level negotiations to see what gets on and what gets left off? These moments are opportunities for us to set priorities, to determine what's most important to us as a family, and then to make sure that those things are the things we do. But there's this subtle nuance that's happening in these conversations, and it's a question about motives. Now, could you tell that she wasn't thrilled with the whole boys' night thing? The eye roll, I think, gave it away. But the question is, why the need for a boys' night? Is it simply to get away from the responsibilities of home? Or maybe it's to find people to connect with and have relationship with that he can be built up by and encourage along the way as well. You know, these questions about perceptions and motives, they matter in relationships, and maybe even more than ever, because relationships continue to get more complicated. You know, it wasn't too long ago that our parents and grandparents met someone at a sock hop. They courted, they dated, they got engaged, married, had kids, and they lived happily ever after. You remember those stories, don't you? And now it goes something like this: which app should I download? And before you even know the person, you have to decide whether you're going to judge them by swiping left or right. And you begin a relationship with all kinds of questions about motives and motivations and perceptions. See, our calendars answer some of those questions for us, but many of the other questions have to be answered in the way that we live life and the way we interact with one another. Relationships are complicated. In fact, there was a 2023 study that was released that talked about the reasons relationships end. We're talking committed relationships, people who thought they were on the pathway to marriage, and some of them were married. And here are some of the reasons those relationships ended. Because the person made poor financial decisions, because they didn't tip their server well, because they uninvitedly ate off of the other person's plate. Maybe that's a good reason. They set up an Instagram account for a pet. They were wearing weird colored lipstick, and this one might actually be appropriate in 2025 because they clapped when the plane landed on the ground. And it's probably true that some arguments, disagreements happened along the way over calendars as well. See, some of those are funny, and some of them are maybe just a little bit too true. And the truth that pulls through actually impacts our relationships. See, the way we experience others is often determined by how we perceive their motives. And how we perceive their motives usually has a whole lot to do with us and a lot less to do with them. Today, I'm going to try to convince you of that truth and give you a couple tidbits that I hope you can take with you to live a life that embraces and empowers the relationships in your life so that you can take steps together. If you're here for the first time today, I'm so thrilled you're here. I saw a few of you walking through the doors as I was out front greeting people. It's a pleasure to have you in this place today. My name is Ryan, and I'm one of the pastors here, and we're continuing a series we're calling the Relationship Playbook. Now, let me give you a recap in case you missed out. We started on Super Bowl Sunday, and we had an incredible day up until the football game. Not so much fun once kickoff happened, but we redeemed this series last week. Because last week, wasn't it a blessing to hear from Olivia? Olivia came and she shared a message with us about the challenges and the benefits of singleness, challenging us to think about how we invest in our relationship with God in a season in which that is the most important thing that we can do. And then Pastor Jim was here, and Pastor Jim had a message for us about how to make relationships last. How do you live a relationship side by side with people that last into the future as Pastor Jim and Marianne sprint past that 40-year mark of happy marriage? Happy for him at least, right? So along the way, we work to find these principles that we can live out in our relationships with others. And the struggle to find joy and contentment in our lives can derail us. It can take all of our attention. And so whether we're divorced or married or single or dating or widowed or somewhere in between, we're on a journey. And if our journey to find joy is dependent upon another person, it will end in disappointment. Our journey to joy begins with a commitment to who God is and what he wants to do in our lives and the principles that we can then live out. So today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some words that Jesus said. Now, Jesus does this frequently where he's having a conversation with some people and there are others listening in to what he's saying. And that's exactly what's going to happen today. And so Jesus goes up on a mountaintop and he's having this time of prayer with God. He's developing this ongoing, intimate relationship, this conversation with God. And so it's during this time of prayer that we assume that Jesus is continuing to hear from God, to understand what God's will is. And when he comes down off of the mountain, he finds a crowd of people. We're going to pick up the story in Luke chapter 6. We're going to start in verse 17. When they came down from the mountain, the disciples stood with Jesus on a large level area surrounded by many of his followers and by the crowds. This crowd of people maybe didn't even know what they were getting into. Maybe they just saw a group of people and they thought, oh, that looks cool. Or perhaps they knew who Jesus was and they came to listen in on the conversation he was having, because Jesus' words in this moment, like many of his other words, are words that are directed at the people who are closest to him. And yet there are those who are privileged to listen in and gain insight from what it is that Jesus is saying. The teaching of Jesus is attractive because regardless of where you are in your life, maybe maybe things are difficult, maybe things are a struggle or a challenge for you. Maybe things are, your life didn't turn out as you hoped it would. Maybe it's not up and to the right. Maybe you're dealing with heartache and loss and pain. Maybe, as is the case for these people, Jesus is giving instructions on how to deal with annoying and needy and hard to deal with people. Whatever the circumstance in life, the words of Jesus, they give us encouragement along the way. And Jesus has, for these people gathered, a message of hope. Here's what he says. Do to others as you would like them to do to you. Now, I don't know about you, but I do have this gift of being able to read something like that and then come up with a bunch of reasons it doesn't apply or places or situations in which it wouldn't apply. Can you relate to that? It's like, yeah, that would be good if the following circumstances are correct. But if they're not, then I will just go ahead and do whatever the heck I wanted to do because I pretty much got this whole thing figured out. Can you relate to that? Have you lived that out sometime in your life? I have, I'm guessing you might have, and the people that are hearing this probably have too, because here's what Jesus does. He gives them this information, and then he gets specific. Here's what he says, verse 36, you must be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate. Do not judge others, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn others, or it will come back to you. Forgive others, and you will be forgiven. Now remember, who's listening? It's a message for the disciples, and yet there's this crowd who is hearing the words that Jesus is saying. This is something that anyone can commit to. Anyone can commit to compassion and not judging. In fact, there are people that are gathered when Jesus is speaking the words that I would imagine weren't sure that they believed that he was who he said he was. That they weren't sure that it was actually for them, but they were just interested in hearing what it is that he had to say. And the same might actually be true in this place today. You may have walked in because there was a promise of brunch at First Watch. And so you're like, sure, I will go and do the church thing because then we're going out to do the thing that I wanted to do. And if that's why you came today, I'm exceptionally glad you're here. And here's why. Because I believe that if you listen to and think about and maybe even try out some of these words of Jesus, that as what one pastor said, following the teachings of Jesus will make your life better and make you better at life. I believe that could happen for you today. And so today, I just want to invite you to consider the truth that is being shared. I want you to consider that maybe what Jesus says is a way that we could live. And if we chose to live that way, that it could, in fact, make us more like the kind of person that we actually want to be, and to make us more like the kind of person that we actually want to be around. And so in case there was any confusion about what Jesus was saying, in case there was any doubt about what his expectation was for the people that he was speaking to, he gives it to us once more. Luke 6:38. Give and you will receive. Your gift will return to you in full, pressed down, shaken together to make room for more, running over, poured out into your lap. The amount you give will determine the amount you get back. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't typically walk into the supermarket and ask them to measure out grain for me, but that's exactly what's happening here. Jesus is teaching them what it looks like to live this way by giving them an example of how it works in their real life. And the example is going to the market. If you've ever been to the farmer's market in downtown Lee Summit, you may have bought some corn from someone one week and you're like, ooh, that corn was not great. And then you buy it from someone else the next week and you're like, yes, delicious. And so the next time you get back, where do you go? The delicious corn, right? You want to go back to that place. And I imagine that this marketplace that Jesus is talking about is much the same. That there are those who generously measure out their grain. That they take the measuring cup, they dip it into the grain, and they make sure that it is so full. In fact, Jesus says they press it down and they make sure that it's overflowing and it's pouring out into your lap when they give it to you. And then there's the person who makes sure that it's just barely touching the top. Because if they give it to you that way, they make a few extra cents, and a few extra cents multiplied over a bunch of customers is a few extra dollars, and it's worth it to them to skimp in order to make a few more bucks. I mean, Jesus is teaching a principle about generosity, about the way that we give with our finances and our resources. But more than that, Jesus is teaching us what it means to be people who are generous relationally. What does it look like for us to invest our lives with others in this way? In other words, here's what Jesus is saying. Remember the last time you opened a bag of potato chips? And it's like 80% air. And then there's like 14 chips at the bottom and your blood is about to boil. Jesus is saying, don't be that. He's saying, don't live like that. Don't let people experience you like that. That when they open it up and they see all that you have to offer, that it's just crumbs in the bottom of a bag. He's saying, overflow with generosity in the way that you interact with the people around you. Or maybe this is a better way to think about it for us. When I think about interacting with people, sometimes I think about maybe the scale upon which our relationship rests, where we're constantly trying to keep it balanced by me doing things and you doing things. And that when you do something, that then I have to do something to make sure that the scale continues to come back into focus, that it's back at its level point. And the beauty of that is that it lets us know constantly where we stand. It tells us, yes, the scale is weighed in my favor, they owe me. Doesn't that feel great? Or maybe it says that they've made a deposit and the scale is now tipping in your favor, and now you can do that thing to them you always wanted to do. And you can get back at them, and you can make that withdrawal from what's on the scale, because the goal, after all, is to keep the scale balanced. And that's a 50-50 approach at relationships. And here's what we know about 50-50 approaches to relationships. They fail 100% of the time. Because when we live like that, when we're keeping score like that, it's impossible to live generously. It's impossible to live the way that Jesus is telling us to live. I'm not the only one who's thought that way, and maybe you've thought that way, and so you're not the only one either because you've got me, but we've both got what was happening in 120 BC. In fact, a rabbi has words to say to people like us about things like this. He says, judge each person with the scales weighted in their favor. In other words, when you have an opportunity to interact with someone, make sure the scales are tipped past center in their favor. Make sure that the scales are tipped past center, giving them the benefit of the doubt, giving them the advantage, allowing them to have the upper hand. And I can tell you what, I am the perfect person to share a message about this. Nobody laughed, not even my wife. Thank you. I'm the perfect person to share this message because I haven't figured this out. I haven't figured out what it looks like to continually give other people the benefit of the doubt. And yet, that's the way I want to live. And so today, I just have something for us to think about, and I have something for us to try out when we leave this place. And here's what we can do. We can try to see the other side. We can try to see the other side. We can hope that we can see what the other person is experiencing, going through, how their life is being lived, and hopefully that can give us perspective when we experience them and then when we try to have relationships with them. In fact, I read recently about a group of people who did just that. They were so committed to this practice of seeing the other people's side that they would gather together weekly, not for worship, not for prayer. They did that another time. They would gather together weekly to make excuses for the people around them who had slighted them. They would make a list of all the ways that they felt less than or hurt or that someone had done them wrong. And after they made the list, they would go through and they would give excuses about why the person may have responded to them in that way. In her book, Walking in the Dust of the Rabbi Jesus, Lois Verberg writes about this encounter. She says, if someone was walking with a heavy load and his next door neighbor drove right past, the group would hypothesize. Here's their list of excuses. Perhaps he was only going a short distance. Perhaps he has already committed himself to pick up some other people, or perhaps he had a problem that weighed on his mind so heavily that he couldn't think of anything else. Can you imagine what your life would look like if every time you had your feelings hurt, or every time you felt slighted, or every time you felt wronged, that the first thing you did is in your mind made an excuse for that person and why they may have done that thing? How different would our lives look? And as I think about doing that, I find it exhausting, frankly. It's overwhelming to spend that much time doing it. So I ask myself, why? And then I'm reminded of what Jesus said in Luke 6:31. Do to others as you would like them to do to you. Now, I don't know about you, but when I measure, the cup doesn't always run over. When I'm weighing out what I've done and what you've done, the scale isn't always weighted in your favor. But if it were, think about how different things would be. I would be offended less often. My reactions would constantly be seasoned with grace and truth. I would be the kind of person that I actually want to be around. And I would think the best about your motives. Now, there's a psychological term that describes this kind of living. And it's important to note that, this is not a biblical term, but understanding the psychology helps us live out the biblical reality. And the psychological term was coined by two licensed therapists. Their names are John and Julie Gottman. And so if you want to know why you do what you do, it's probably from one of two things. It's either positive sentiment override or negative sentiment override. So here's what I want to do. I want us to think about whether or not we have a chance of being successful at this idea. Remember it? Try to see the other side. Can you be successful in doing that? Well, here's the answer to the question. How do you see the people around you? Let me define the terms for you. Positive sentiment override ascribes positive or neutral intent to actions. And you're so smart, you're going to know the answer to this. That means negative sentiment override ascribes negative intent to actions. It's the same actions that are perceived in completely different ways based on, don't miss this, my mindset. The actions don't change, but my perception of the actions does change. Maybe think about it in these terms. Your significant other gets home late from work. You worked so hard getting the dinner ready, and it was going to be delicious, and you couldn't wait for everybody to eat it, and it's cold by the time they slide in. And so you can say to yourself, well, they must have forgot that we were having dinner, or they didn't plan in time to get home, or they always do this, right? Negative sentiment override. Or they could not make it home in time for dinner. And the story you tell yourself as you're sitting at home waiting is that they got caught helping someone whose car wouldn't start, or they stopped to get gas on the way home so you wouldn't have to when you go out for a family outing this weekend, or maybe they just got caught in traffic. Now, eventually, we will know the story, won't we? But until we know the story, we have a story we have told ourselves. How is it that you're thinking about others? What are you ascribing to their motives? Is it positive or is it negative? So often we decide how we're going to perceive things before we actually know the whole story. So often the scale is weighted in our favor. And here's the thing. We can change the entire climate of our relationships if we will simply choose to do this one thing, to try to see the other side. So today, I just want to give you two quick things as we wrap up that maybe you can do as you leave this place to begin to live this out. This is this week's relationship playbook. Number one is to seek connection. Now, I don't know if you're a college basketball fan, but it has been a really tough week for some of us. If you're not paying attention, the Kansas Jayhawks lost twice last week to unranked teams. They spent the week in Utah, tried to right the ship. It did not work out so well. It has not been great. On the other hand, the Missouri Tigers beat number 4 ranked Alabama last week. I know you're out there. I got it. Hey, we deserve it right now, right? Although Kansas did win yesterday and Missouri did not. So anyway. On the other side of these college basketball games, there are two coaches that have to give press conferences. And one of the coaches, the Missouri coach, stands up and he says, the thing I loved about the way our team played is they played connected. They stayed together. The defense was moving as one. It's like, oh, that's great. I mean, that's how your defense wins. That's how you beat a number 4 team. And then you have Bill Self's comments, Kansas coach. Here's what he says. He says, I'm talked out. We need to get away from each other. I'll tell you that point blank. I thought this would be a great opportunity to do some team bonding, but it hasn't. When we feel disconnected, it's hard to win. It's hard to win at basketball. It's hard to win in our relationships. And so how do we build connection in our relationships? Today, I just want to give you one quick thing that you can do. It's not the answer to all your problems, but it may be something that you can leave here and do immediately. And it's from the animal kingdom. This is what Gento penguins do. They're Antarctic penguins. They're cute little birds. And you can see that bird has a little rock in its mouth. See, what these birds do is they go to the water and they dive in and they go down to the bottom and they root around and they search for the perfect round pebble. It has to be the right size, it has to be the right color, it has to be the right texture. All of these things matter. And when they find the perfect rock, they ascend to the surface, they come out and they present the pebble to their desired mate. It's a concept known as pebbling. And pebbling is the way that they win someone over. It's a small gift. It doesn't cost much. It doesn't mean much. It's eventually taken. It's used to build a nest for the penguin. But this pebbling is something that we can do. How do we pebble? It's the small, thoughtful gift that the other person had no idea that you knew they wanted. It's the kind word of affirmation. It's the act of service at home. Maybe if you're the person who doesn't know how to load the dishwasher, maybe you take a graduate level course and you learn how to do that so your significant other doesn't have to all the time. It's these little things in life that can make a huge difference in our relationships. And here's one that goes maybe just a step further and maybe just a generation younger. This pebbling is also talked about when it comes to digital life. So does anybody have someone in their life that sends them lots of reels, posts, text, emails, whatever? Anybody have that person? Yes, we all have that person. Here's the thing. I used to get annoyed with all of the reels, calls, text, emails that I got forwarding me all this stuff. But you know what I decided? I decided not to be annoyed because of pebbling. See, another thing you can do to pebble is you can forward someone something that you know they're going to like. You can send them a reel or a meme or a post or a text or whatever it is. And so every time I get a reel from one of my kids, I'm like, oh, they're thinking about me. And they may not be, but it sure makes me feel good, right? See, so it's these relational connections that continue when we do small things to invest in relationships with people around us. We build connection by lots of things, but one thing that we can do is pebbling. Number 2, the second thing I want to give you for your relationship playbook is to recognize strengths. Recognize strengths. It's important to acknowledge where other people are winning in your life. And this is a place that I think, as we talk about people who have been married or getting married or want to stay married, whatever the case is, this gets really hard to do because you're together all the time. I get that. Here's what Dr. John Gottman says about this. He writes, fondness and admiration are two of the most crucial elements in a rewarding and long-lasting romance. Although happily married couples may feel driven to distraction at times by their partner's personality flaws, they still feel that the person they married is worthy of honor and respect. We build our relationship with the people around us by continuing to remind ourselves why we are in the relationship in the first place. And it's true at work too. Jim Collins wrote in his book, Good to Great, if we get the right people on the bus, the right people in the right seats, and the wrong people off the bus, we'll figure out how to take it someplace great. If you get people in a spot where they can win, it makes all the difference in the world. None of this is magic. It doesn't happen instantaneously. It's not going to be better in just a moment when we walk out of this place. But when I choose to judge others with the scale weighted in their favor, when I choose to press down the measuring cup and fill it to overflowing, when I choose to try to see the other side, it allows the opportunity for relational growth in a way that gives way to longevity. So the next time your significant other is late, the next time your kid is annoying the tar out of you, the next time the backpack and the shoes are left in the middle of the floor where they don't belong, the next time the stuff is at the bottom of the stairs and everybody walks by it for a week without taking it up, the next time, whatever it is that annoys you, try to see the other side. And when you do, your relationships will certainly benefit.